Before he died, Frank Sinatra made a secret list of the 5 actresses he thought had the worst hygiene ever. Yeah, you heard that right. Frank Sinatra, Mr. Cool, Mr. Chairman of the board, actually told people about this list. He took tons of secrets to his grave, but this one, nope, he didn't keep it quiet. He spilled it to his closest buddies late at night. Imagine being in the room when that happened. Crazy, right? Frank was a total perfectionist. He wanted everything just right always. He was super controlling, almost like nothing could be out of place, and oh boy was he sensitive. Sensitive to every little sight he saw, every sound he heard, and especially every smell that came near him. Because of that super powerful nose of his, he kept a secret mental blacklist. It was a list of some of the most glamorous, beautiful women in all of Hollywood, women everyone thought were perfect. But in Frank's opinion, they failed his impossible, crazy high personal hygiene rules. Can you believe someone that famous would care so much about how people smelled? His longtime valet, the guy who took care of his clothes and helped him every day, told stories about Frank's habits. Frank changed his clothes 3 times every single day. 3 times, and get this, he showered before sex and then showered again right after, every time. That's how clean he wanted to be. His personal cologne collection, it was worth more money than most normal people's entire houses. We're talking crazy expensive bottles of fancy smells. His nose didn't just notice things, it ruled his whole life. And sadly, that same nose caused problems and even ended some of his relationships. When something smelled wrong to Frank, it was a big deal. Late at night, usually around 2:00 a.m., when everyone else was asleep, Frank would hang out with his inner circle, his ride-or-die friends. The scotch would be flowing, glasses clinking, smoke in the air, and that's when Frank would really start talking. He'd hold court like a king, giving brutal, no-filter opinions about the women he'd dated or loved. The kind of stuff that would make today's gossip bloggers turn bright red and say, whoa, too far. Nothing was off limits. Nothing at all. But the thing that got him the most upset, the thing he called the cardinal sin, bad body odor, offensive smells, that drove him up the wall more than anything. One of the guys who was always around him remembered a classic Frank moment. On stage, in front of thousands of people, Frank would be smooth as ever. He'd take a beautiful leading lady's hand, kiss it gently, look into her eyes, and call her darling in that famous voice. Everyone would melt, but then they'd get back to the hotel, and boom, for a full hour Frank would rant and rave about how repulsive her stench was. He'd stand there scrubbing his hands raw in the sink like he was trying to wash away the memory of her smell. Picture that scene, smooth on stage, furious in private. Wild. So tonight we're going to spill all the tea. We're exposing the 5 Oscar-winning actresses who landed at the very top of Frank Sinatra's secret nasal nightmare list. These were women the whole world saw as Hollywood goddesses, perfect, untouchable, dreamy. But behind closed doors, Frank said they were hiding phylactery horrors. That's a fancy way of saying smells so bad they attacked his nose like a nightmare. And listen, this isn't me guessing. This isn't random second-hand gossip someone made up. These rankings come straight from the people who were actually there, the ones who heard Frank's unfiltered, late-night confessions with their own ears. And when you hear who's on the list and why, it shows way more than just Frank had a sensitive nose. It shows a guy who had a deep, almost crazy need to control everything around him. That need ran his love life, and in the end, it broke some of his most important connections. His drummer, the guy who played with him for 15 whole years, once explained it perfectly. He said, Frank could control everything, the lighting on stage, the tempo of the music, even the temperature in the room, everything except his own heart, and that made him furious. When a woman got close enough to really touch his feelings, to get under his skin, Frank would suddenly fixate on some physical flaw. He'd zoom in on it like a laser. And the stronger his feelings were for her, the crueler and meaner his words about that flaw would get. Nobody made Frank feel bigger emotions than these 5 women. And because of that, nobody suffered his super picky, sensory wrath more than they did. Okay, let's count it down. Number 5. 5. Shelley Winters. Shelley was wild, loud, totally unpredictable, all over the place in the best and worst ways. Frank once said kissing her felt like licking an ashtray that someone had wrapped in a wet dog. Ouch, that's harsh. Shelley Winters came crashing into Frank Sinatra's life back in 1950 like a tornado. She was every thing he was. Where Frank was buttoned up and perfect, Shelley was uncensored, completely uninhibited, and 0% interested in the suffocating everything has to be perfect life that Frank demanded from himself and everyone around him. Frank ironed the creases in his pants while he was still wearing them. That's how intense he was about looking sharp. Shelley, she'd literally roll out of bed, look at the clothes scattered all over her floor, pick one up and wear it. No iron, no fuss, no problem. A makeup artist who worked with both of them said Frank was actually terrified of Shelley's chaotic energy. Her apartment looked like a tornado had hit a thrift shop and then kept spinning. Clothes everywhere, dishes piled up, random stuff all over. She'd wear the exact same dress 3 days in a row without thinking twice. She'd eat a ton of garlic and then laugh right in your face while breathing on you. To Frank, that was like psychological warfare. It was a direct attack on every single thing he stood for: cleanliness, order, perfection. Their little affair started fast and burned super hot, and then it crashed in the most spectacular way possible. In public, Frank blamed it on incompatible schedules. But in private, oh man, he went off. He gave long, detailed critiques of Shelley's personal habits that became legendary stories inside his inner circle. Everyone knew them. She was brilliant when the cameras were rolling, nobody could deny that. But off-screen, her apartment supposedly smelled like old soup mixed with cheap hairspray. One of Frank's longtime crew members spilled that detail. Every time Frank came back from hanging out at her place, he'd march straight to the shower and stay there for a full 45 minutes. He'd stand under the water muttering about contamination like he'd been exposed to something dangerous. Years later, Shelley herself admitted she did some of it on purpose. She knew Frank was a total germaphobe and she loved poking at him. She told a friend, "I knew it drove him crazy when I ate with my fingers, so I'd order the messiest food possible: ribs, spaghetti, anything drippy and sticky. The man was too perfect. Someone needed to ruffle his feathers." And ruffle them she did. Their relationship was doomed from day one. Frank supposedly told his valet one night, "We had a brief fling in the 50s. It didn't last. Neither did the air freshener I used afterward." Classic Frank burn. For Zaza Gabber. Zaza looked like money, pure glamour, diamonds, furs, the whole package. But Frank said her perfume was so strong it could clear out an entire ballroom in seconds. If Shelley Winters was one extreme on Frank's smell nightmare scale, the raw, natural, unwashed human scent, then Hungarian bombshell Zaza Gabber was the total opposite extreme. She went heavy on synthetic chemical overload. Way too much perfume, powder, everything artificial. It completely overwhelmed Frank's already super-sensitive nose. She bathed in Chanel No. 5, dusted herself with powder, and then reapplied every 20 minutes like clockwork. After one especially suffocating date night, Frank complained to his bandmates, "I didn't know if I was dating a woman or walking through a duty-free airport shop. The smell was everywhere." Their romance lasted 6 weeks in 1954. 6 weeks total. Frank's sinuses could only tolerate about 1 week of it. His personal assistant said Frank would come home from evenings with Zaza looking like he'd been tear-gassed, eyes bloodshot, handkerchief permanently pressed to his nose. Behind all the glamour, Frank told his inner circle, there was a cloud of chemical warfare. He claimed the scent clung to his clothes so stubbornly that one time he actually burned a $600 tuxedo instead of sending it to the dry cleaner. The cleaner couldn't kill the smell. Nothing could. Frank said that perfume survived like a cockroach after a nuclear winter, unstoppable. The absolute final straw happened during a weekend getaway in Palm Springs. Zaza, trying to be romantic, spritzed some of her perfume on Frank's pillow. Sweet gesture, right? Wrong. Frank couldn't handle it. He slept in a different bedroom that night and ended the whole relationship the very next morning. His home chef remembered. Frank said he could still taste her perfume in his food 3 days after seeing her. He'd send back entire plates saying they were contaminated with Zaza. At first we thought the food really was bad, but eventually we realized it was all in his head. Still, you never questioned Frank's senses if you wanted to keep your job. 3. Judy Garland. Frank absolutely loved Judy's talent, loved it, but her energy, her smell, not so much. He described her as a nervous breakdown walking around in high heels and said she carried all that stress and fear in her sweat. The connection between Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland was deeper than just romance. It went way beyond dating. They looked at each other and saw the same inner demons, the same insecurities, the same self-destructive habits, the same darkness. When they performed together, magic happened. Those duets are still talked about as some of the greatest moments in entertainment history. But behind closed doors, in private, Frank couldn't handle the physical side of Judy's inner chaos. After one especially tough week with her in 1954, he told his entourage, "Benzedrine, bourbon, and stage panic do not mix well. Their songs were electric on stage, but the dressing room not so much." People who were really close to him said his complaints about Judy's smell were actually Frank's way of running from his own problems. In Judy, he saw a mirror, a reflection of his own addictions, his own anxieties, his own fears. His longtime road manager explained it like this: Frank was running from the exact same demons that were catching up to Judy. When he talked about her smell, he was really talking about his fear of what happens when you lose control. And control was everything to Frank. As time went on, the way Frank described Judy's scent got more and more clinical, almost like a scientist. He'd break it down with scary precision: 40% pharmaceutical, 30% fear, 20% booze, 10% talent burning way too bright. The sad, ironic part: Frank was fighting exactly the same battles: pills, alcohol, crippling stage fright. But instead of giving in like Judy sometimes did, he channeled all that fear into obsessive cleanliness and control. What makes Judy's spot on this list extra heartbreaking is that Frank genuinely loved her, maybe more deeply and more honestly than any woman except his final wife. But he couldn't separate the person he loved from the sensory experience his nose hated. That wall he built between them was too strong to tear down. To 2. Marilyn Monroe. Yes, Marilyn, the Marilyn, Frank adored her, really, truly adored her. But he was brutally honest with his close friends. He once said, "She smelled like beauty and breakdown." According to Frank, long shooting days, panic attacks that made her sweat, and melting makeup all mixed together into a sweet, rotten smell he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. Nothing on Frank's entire olfactory blacklist shocked his inner circle more than seeing Marilyn Monroe's name on it. This was America's ultimate sex symbol. Her posters were hanging in soldiers' barracks, in offices, in teenagers' bedrooms, everywhere. Everyone thought she was perfection. But according to Frank, she was a huge sensory disappointment that he couldn't match up with how perfect she looked. A makeup artist who worked with both of them explained, Frank expected Marilyn to smell like the fantasy she sold to the world, like some impossible mix of vanilla, sex, and pure innocence. When he realized she was a real woman who sweated, who had real body smells, he almost couldn't process it. Their brief affair happened in 1961, right when Marilyn was depending more and more on prescription pills and alcohol. Frank said those substances changed her natural scent in ways that became harder and harder for him to handle. She was iconic, he told a small group of trusted friends, but even icons sweat through silk. He went into almost doctor-level detail about how her perfect outside look would slowly fall apart over a long day. Makeup melting, perspiration building up, the pills and booze seeping out through her pores. One of his entourage members remembered him saying, "She smelled like a beautiful department store 1 hour before closing." All the expensive perfumes mixing with real human reality after the air conditioning failed. What makes Marilyn's case so revealing is that Frank couldn't separate his fantasy version of her from the actual biological human being. All his complaints focused on that gap, the huge difference between the flawless image he built in his head and the normal, imperfect human he experienced in real life. His longtime physician said it best: Frank couldn't forgive Marilyn for being mortal. He'd built her up as this flawless creation, and the perfectly normal human smells she produced shattered that illusion. It was never really about her. It was about his own impossible expectations. One Ava Gardner's. The love of his life, the one who, according to Frank, smelled like war. Their passion was nuclear, explosive, intense, unstoppable. Their fights were legendary, screaming, throwing things, pure drama, but Frank told his friends, Ava was all gin, cigarettes, and pure fury. I could never quit her, but I could barely breathe around her. She broke my heart and my sinuses at the same time. No woman ever took over Frank Sinatra's senses the way Ava Gardner did. Their relationship, the wild marriage, the messy divorce, the on and off connection that lasted decades, was the single biggest emotional battle of his entire life. He never got over her. Never. And according to everyone in his inner circle, he never stopped complaining about her scent either. His longtime road manager put it perfectly. Ava was Frank's addiction, and like any addict, he built up a crazy love-hate relationship with the thing he couldn't quit. His obsession with how she smelled was really about how helpless he felt around her. He couldn't control his feelings for her, so he tried to control everything else, including the air around her. Over the years, Frank's descriptions of Ava's scent got more and more elaborate, almost like poetry. What started as simple complaints about cigarettes and alcohol turned into long, detailed lists of every way she attacked his senses. Those lists showed way more about Frank's emotional state than they did about Ava's actual hygiene. Late at night, after a few drinks, he'd get poetic. He'd call her scent the perfume of self-destruction, a fragrance that was disgusting and irresistible at the exact same time. A musician who played with Sinatra all through the 1960s remembered. Frank said kissing Ava was like licking an ashtray while someone punched you in the heart. But when he said it, he'd get this faraway look, like he was talking about something he still craved more than oxygen. What made Ava different from every other woman on the list was Frank's total mixed-up, confused feelings. With the others, his smell complaints were simple rejection. She smells bad, I'm done. With Ava, it was complicated. He still wanted her. He still loved her. That push-pull tortured him for years after their marriage ended. His longtime psychiatrist said, he never resolved Ava. That unfinished business came out through this physical fixation. He could dismiss other women by saying they smelled bad, but with Ava, the smell was part of why he couldn't let go. It was like her scent had branded him forever. Ava Gardner stayed #1 on Frank Sinatra's olfactory blacklist until the day he died. Not because her smell was objectively the worst, but because it had dug itself deepest into his memory. It became impossible to separate her scent from his own emotional vulnerability. Frank Sinatra built his entire existence around one thing: control. He controlled his singing voice with machine-like precision, every note perfect. He controlled entire rooms just by walking in, using only his personality and charisma. He controlled his image down to the tiniest millimeter fold of his pocket square. He controlled his performances through obsessive, endless rehearsal. He terrified musicians who missed a single note and lighting guys who got a cue wrong by even a second. But the one thing Frank Sinatra could never control, his own heart, his feelings. His longtime psychiatrist explained the real reason behind all the smell obsession. It was never about hygiene, it was emotional self-defense. Whenever someone got past his armor, whenever a woman made him feel something deep and messy that he couldn't manage, he'd retreat into these super harsh sensory judgments. It felt safer to say, she smells bad, than to admit, she makes me feel vulnerable. This pattern showed up strongest with the women who had the most power over his emotions. The more a woman could shake him up inside, the higher she climbed on his smell blacklist. Not because she actually smelled bad to normal people, but because she had broken through the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. A sound engineer who worked with Frank for decades said, he weaponized his own sensitivity. His ears could hear one slightly flat note in a 40-piece orchestra. His tongue could name the exact vineyard of a wine in a blind tasting. His nose could pick out different colognes from across a crowded room. Those weren't just fun party tricks, they were control tools. By turning big, complicated emotional connections into simple "she smells bad" complaints, Frank created the illusion that he was choosing to walk away. He pretended the problem was their smell, not his feelings. It protected his ego from the scary truth. Sometimes he felt powerless in love. His road manager summed it up. The women who made his smell list were exactly the women who made him feel something real and strong. The bigger the feeling, the bigger and meaner the complaint. Ava was number one because she took over his heart more completely than anyone. His nose was just a convenient excuse. But here's the real stench in this whole story. It's not coming from those five legendary actresses. The true bad smell is the toxic mix of unchecked male power, entourages who never said no, and Hollywood's machine that protects its biggest stars while hiding the ugly truth. Frank Sinatra could keep making these private, harsh judgments about famous women for one reason: the system protected men like him. Cultural icons, super valuable stars, their commercial worth made them untouchable. No one ever held them accountable. A female studio executive who worked with Sinatra in the 1960s said it plain: nobody ever told Frank no, not his mother when he was young, not the movie studios once he became too big to lose, and definitely not the men who surrounded him every day. He lived in an accountability-free zone. His perceptions, no matter how twisted by insecurity, ego, or hypersensitivity, were treated like objective facts. The men in his inner circle, the ones repeating these smell stories, played a classic role in male celebrity culture. They reinforced whatever the star said, no matter how far from reality it was. One longtime member admitted, "We all laughed when Frank went on these rants about women's smells, even when we knew it was ridiculous, even when we'd spent time with the same woman and noticed nothing strange at all. But your job in Frank's circle wasn't to challenge him. It was to nod and agree with whatever story protected his self-image." That closed circle turned Frank's subjective, emotional experiences into fact inside the group, and then into Hollywood legend after he died. Meanwhile, the women being judged lived under completely different rules. They were expected to look flawless in public at all times while dealing with real stress: 16-hour workdays, hot lights, tight costumes, anxiety, exhaustion, all while projecting constant perfection. A costume designer who worked with all five actresses said, "The miracle isn't that they sometimes perspired or needed stronger perfume. The miracle is that they looked so flawless under such inhuman conditions." Because of the huge power imbalance, Frank could define these women through his own nose without anyone ever turning the same judgment back on him. No one cataloged his cigarette breath, the alcohol leaking through his pores during performances, or the pharmacy of uppers and downers he took to survive his crazy schedule. His physician pointed out, Frank was never held to the same standards he forced on women. His body was never scrutinized the way he scrutinized theirs. That double standard is the real scandal. And here's the final laugh, the biggest irony of all. Despite Frank Sinatra's legendary status, his attempt to shrink these women down to just their physical flaws completely failed in the long run. History doesn't judge them by how they smelled. History judges them by their incredible talent, their massive cultural impact, and the artistic legacies that still shine bright today. Shelley Winters won 2 Academy Awards and created unforgettable characters in tough, challenging roles across decades. Judy Garland gave performances that still make people cry generations after she's gone. Marilyn Monroe became so much more than a movie star. She became a global icon whose image is instantly recognizable anywhere in the world. Ava Gardner's fierce talent and independent spirit proved she was way more than just a beautiful face. She was a force. Even Zsa Zsa Gabor, who some people laughed at and said was famous for being famous, built a clever, self-aware celebrity persona that basically predicted reality television decades before it existed. Meanwhile, Frank's private judgments, kept alive only because his loyal male entourage repeated them, end up revealing way more about his own limits than about the women he tried to criticize. A film historian who studies Hollywood's golden age said it perfectly. The women outlived the insults. Sinatra thought he was cataloging their flaws, but he was actually documenting his own inability to see women as full, complex human beings instead of just sensory experiences for him to enjoy or reject. For all his artistic genius, Frank Sinatra stayed stuck in a basically teenage way of thinking about women. He worshipped them from far away as perfect fantasies, then recoiled in disgust the moment they showed themselves as real people with real bodies and normal human functions. His psychiatrist concluded, Frank could only love the image, never the reality. The minute a woman stopped being his fantasy projection and started being an actual person with her own physical existence, he felt betrayed. His nose wasn't the problem, his emotional immaturity was. Shelley Winters, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and Ava Gardner have all been gone for years now. They can't defend themselves against these old smell stories. But they don't need to. Their work speaks louder than any gossip. Their movies, their songs, their performances go far beyond petty judgments from a man who, despite all his extraordinary gifts, never fully grew up enough to stop reducing complicated women to simple smell complaints. In the court of history, talent gives the final verdict. And by that measure, these five women don't just survive Frank Sinatra's supposed olfactory blacklist. They completely rise above it and leave it in the dust. The man who sang about flying to the moon, reaching for the stars, and sailing beyond the sea. The man who created timeless music that still makes people fall in love couldn't handle the normal, earthy realities of real intimacy with real women. Frank Sinatra's alleged list reveals way less about those five actresses than it does about the man who supposedly made it. A control freak whose super heightened senses made him one of the greatest artists ever, but also made him a deeply limited, emotionally stunted romantic partner. His brutally honest late-night assessments, saved and passed down by his almost all-male inner circle, show the huge gap between the sophisticated, unflappable public Frank and the private Frank who crumbled when faced with normal human imperfection. Instead of owning his vulnerability, he hid behind hypercritical smell complaints. The women on his list, Shelley Winters, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and Ava Gardner, remain shining icons of Hollywood's golden age. Their talent and cultural importance stay untouched by decades-old gossip about personal hygiene. If anything, Frank's obsession with how they smelled only highlights his own basic inability to look past the surface and see the full, complex human beings underneath. By fixating on their scents, Frank was actually mapping the exact places where each woman had broken through his carefully built emotional armor. The real story isn't that five legendary actresses sometimes sweated, wore too much perfume, or carried the natural smells of their stressful, hardworking lives. The real story is that America's most celebrated male singer, a man who could pour more emotion into one single phrase than most singers manage in an entire career, remained emotionally immature in his private relationships. He could never fully reconcile his dreamy fantasies of feminine perfection with the normal biological realities of actual living women. Frank may have made a list of their smells, but these five women left a far bigger, far more lasting impression, not as unpleasant sensory memories, but as powerful artists whose work continues to move, inspire, and amaze audiences long after both their physical presence and Frank's complaints about it faded into old Hollywood legend.